Levi Strauss models his investigations quite consciously on structural linguistics, particularly on the work of Trubetskoy and Jacobson. He repeatedly and quite correctly emphasizes that one cannot simply apply procedures analogous to those of phonetic analysis to subsystems of society and culture. Rather, he is concerned with structures where they may be found in the kinship system, political ideology, mythology, ritual, art, and so on. See his work titled The Savage Mind. And he wishes to examine the formal properties of these structures in their own terms. But several reservations are necessary when structural linguistics is used as a model in this way. For one thing, the structure of a phonological system is of very little interest as a formal object. There is nothing of significance to be said from a formal point of view about a set of 40-odd elements cross-classified in terms of 8 or 10 features. The significance of structuralist phonology, as developed by Trubetskoy, Jacobson, and others, lies not in the formal properties of phonetic systems, but in the fact that a fairly small number of features that can be specified in absolute language-independent terms appear to provide the basis for the organization of all phonological systems. The achievement of structuralist phonology was to show that the phonological rules of a great variation variety of languages apply to classes of elements that can be simply characterized in terms of these features. That historical change affects such classes in a uniform way, and that the organization of features plays a basic role in the use and acquisition of language. This was a discovery of the greatest importance, and it provides the groundwork for much of contemporary linguistics. But if we abstract away from the specific universal set of features and the rule systems in which they function, little of any significance remains. Furthermore, to a greater and greater extent, current work in phonology is demonstrating that the real richness of phonological systems lies not in the structural patterns of phonemes, but rather in the intricate systems of rules by which these patterns are formed, modified, and elaborated. See the discussion and the references cited in the previous reading. These structural patterns that arise at a various stage of derivation are a kind of epiphenomenon. The system of phonological rules makes use of the universal features in a fundamental way. The study of universal features is itself in considerable flux. And it is the properties of the systems of rules, it seems to me, that really shed light on the specific nature of the organization of language. For example, there appear to be very general conditions, such as the principle of cyclic ordering, discussed in preceding readings, and others that are still more abstract that govern the application of these rules. And there are many interesting and unsolved questions as to how the choice of rules is determined by intrinsic universal relations among features. Furthermore, the idea of a mathematical investigation of language structures, to which Levi Strauss occasionally alludes, becomes meaningful only when one considers systems of rules with infinite generative capacity. There is nothing to be said about the abstract structure of the various patterns that appear at various stages of derivation. If this is correct, then one cannot expect structuralist phonology in itself to provide a useful model for investigation of other cultural or social systems. In general, the problem of extending concepts of linguistic structure to other cognitive systems seems to me for the moment in not too promising a state, although it is no doubt too early for pessimism. Before turning to the general implications of the study of linguistic competence, and more specifically to the conclusions of universal grammar, it is well to make sure of the status of these conclusions in the light of current knowledge of the possible diversity of language. In my first lecture, I quoted remarks of William Dwight Whitney about what he referred to as, quote, the infinite diversity of human speech, end quote, the boundless variety that he maintained undermines the claims of philosophical grammar to the psychological relevance. Philosophical grammarians had typically maintained that languages vary little in their deep structures. Though there may be wide variability in surface manifestations, there is, however, in this view an underlying structure of grammatical relations and categories, and certain aspects of human thought and mentality are essentially invariant. across languages, although languages may differ as to whether they express the grammatical relations formally by inflection or word order, for example. Furthermore, an investigation of their work indicates that the underlying recursive principles that generate deep structure were assumed to be restricted in certain ways. For example, by the condition that new structures are formed only by the insertion of new propositional content, new structures that themselves correspond to actual simple sentences in fixed positions in already formed structures. Similarly, the grammatical transformations that form surface structures through reordering, ellipsis, and other formal operations must themselves meet certain fixed general conditions, such as those discussed in the preceding lecture. In short, the theories of philosophical grammar and the more recent elaborations of these theories make the assumption that the languages will differ very little, despite considerable diversity in superficial realization, when we discover their deeper structures and unearth their fundamental mechanisms and principles. It is interesting to observe that this assumption persisted even through the period of German Romanticism, which was, of course, much preoccupied with the diversity of cultures and with the many rich possibilities for human intellectual development. Thus, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who is now best remembered for his ideas concerning the variety of languages and the association of diverse language structures with divergent worldviews, nevertheless held firmly that underlying any human language we will find a system that is universal, that simply expresses humankind's unique intellectual attributes. For this reason, it was possible for him to maintain the rationalist view that language is not really learned, certainly not taught, but rather develops from within, in an essential predetermined way when the appropriate environmental conditions exist. One cannot really teach a first language, he argued, but can only provide the thread along which it will develop of its own accord, by processes more like maturation than learning. This Platonistic element in Humboldt's thought is a persuasive one and pervasive one. For Humboldt, it was as natural to propose an essentially Platonistic theory of learning as it was for Rousseau to found his critique of repressive social institutions on a conception of human freedom that derives from strictly Cartesian assumptions regarding the limitations of mechanical explanation. And in general, it seems appropriate to construe both the psychology and the linguistics of the Romantic period as in a large part a natural outgrowth of rationalist conceptions. And for some discussion of these matters, see also Cartesian linguistics. The issue raised by Whitney against Humboldt and philosophical grammar in general is of great significance with respect to the implications of linguistics for general human psychology. Evidently, these implications can be truly far-reaching only if the rationalist view is essentially correct, in which case the structure of language can truly serve as a mirror of mind, in both its particular and its universal aspects. It is widely believed that modern anthropology has established the falsity of the assumptions of the rationalist universal grammarians by demonstrating through empirical study that languages may, in fact, exhibit the widest diversity. Whitney's claims regarding the diversity of languages are reiterated throughout the modern period. Martin Jewes, for example, is simply expressing the conventional wisdom when he takes the basic conclusion of modern anthropological linguistics to be that languages can differ without limit as to their extent or their direction. The belief that anthropological linguistics has demolished the assumptions of universal grammar seems to me to be quite false in two important respects. First, it misinterprets the views of classical rationalist grammar, which held that languages are similar only at the deeper level, the level at which grammatical relations are expressed, and at which the processes that provide for the creative aspect of language use are to be found. Second, this belief seriously misinterprets the findings of anthropological linguistics, which has in fact restricted itself almost completely to fairly superficial aspects of language structure. To say this is not to criticize anthropological linguistics, a field that is faced with compelling problems of its own, in particular the problem of attaining at least some record of the rapidly vanishing languages of the primitive world. Nevertheless, it is important to bear in mind this fundamental limitation on its achievements in considering the light that it can shed on the theses of universal grammar. Anthropological studies, like structural linguistic studies in general, do not attempt to reveal the underlying core of generative processes in language. That is the processes that determine the deeper levels of structure and that constitute the systematic means for creating even novel sentence types. Therefore, they obviously cannot have any real bearing on the classical assumption that these underlying generative processes vary only slightly from language to language. In fact, what evidence is now available suggests that if universal grammar has serious defects, as indeed it does from a modern point of view, then these defects lie in the failure to recognize the abstract nature of linguistic structure and to impose sufficiently strong and restrictive conditions on the form of any human language. And a characteristic feature of current work in linguistics is its concern for linguistic universals of a sort that can only be detected through a detailed investigation of particular languages, universals governing properties of language that are simply not accessible to investigation within the restricted framework that has been adopted, often for very good reasons, however, within anthropological linguistics. I think that if we contemplate the classical problem of psychology, that of accounting for human knowledge, we cannot avoid being struck by the enormous disparity between knowledge and experience. In the case of language, between the generative grammar that expresses the linguistic competence of native speaker and the meager and degenerate data on the basis of which he has constructed his grammar for himself. In principle, the theory of learning should deal with this problem, but in fact it bypasses the problem because of the conceptual gap that I mentioned earlier. The problem cannot even be formulated in any sensible way until we develop the concept of competence alongside the concepts of learning and behavior and apply this concept in some domains. So we're talking about the psychology of learning and behavior itself. And the fact is that this concept has so far been extensively developed and applied only in the study of human language. It is only in this domain that we have at least the first steps toward an account of competence, namely the fragmentary generative grammars that have actually been constructed for particular languages. As the study of language progresses, we can expect with some confidence that these grammars will be extended in scope and in depth, although it will hardly come as a surprise if the first proposals are found to be mistaken in fundamental ways. Insofar as we have a tentative first approximation to a generative grammar for some language, we can, for the first time, formulate in a useful way the problem of origin of knowledge. In other words, we can ask the question, what initial structure must be attributed to the mind that enables it to construct such a grammar from the data of sense? Some of the empirical conditions that must be met by any such assumption about innate structure are moderately clear. Thus, it appears to be a species-specific capacity that is essentially independent of intelligence, and we can make a fairly good estimate of the amount of data that is necessary for the task to be successfully accomplished. We know that the grammars that are in fact constructed vary only slightly among speakers of the same language, despite wide variations not only in intelligence but also in the conditions under which language is acquired. As participants in a certain culture, we are naturally aware of the great differences in ability to use language, in knowledge of vocabulary, and so on that result from differences in native ability and from differences in conditions of acquisition. We naturally pay much less attention to the similarities and to common knowledge, which we take for granted. But if we manage to establish the requisite psychic distance, if we actually compare the generative grammars that must be postulated for different speakers of the same language, we find that the similarities that we take for granted are quite marked and that the divergences are few and marginal. What is more, it seems that dialects that are superficially quite remote, even barely intelligible on first contact, share a vast central core of common rules and processes and differ very slightly in underlying structures, which seem to remain invariant through long historical eras. Furthermore, we discover a substantial system of principles that do not vary among languages that are, as far as we know and can tell, entirely unrelated. The central problems in this domain are empirical ones that are, in principle at least, quite straightforward, difficult as they may be to solve in a satisfactory way. We must postulate an innate structure that is rich enough to account for the disparity between experience and knowledge, one that account for the construction of the empirically justified generative grammars within the given limitations of time and access to data. At the same time, the postulated innate mental structure must not be so rich and restrictive so as to exclude certain known languages. There is, in other words, an upper bound and a lower bound on the degree and exact character of the complexity that can be postulated as innate mental structure. The factual situation is obscure enough to leave room for much difference of opinion over the true nature of this innate mental structure that makes acquisition of language possible. However, there seems to me to be no doubt that this is an empirical issue, one that can be resolved by proceeding along the lines that I have just roughly outlined. My own estimate of the situation is that the real problem for tomorrow is that that of discovering an assumption regarding innate structure that is sufficiently rich, not that of finding one that is simple or elementary enough to be plausible. There is, as far as I can tell, no reasonable notion of plausibility, no a priori insight into what innate structures are permissible, that can guide the search for a, quote, sufficiently elementary assumption, unquote. It would be mere dogmatism to maintain, without argument or evidence, that the mind is simpler in its innate structure than other biological systems, just as it would be mere dogmatism to insist that the mind's organization must necessarily follow certain set principles, determined in advance of investigation and maintained in defiance of any empirical findings. I think that the study of problems of mind has been very definitely hampered by a kind of a priorism with which these problems are generally approached. In particular, the empiricist assumptions that have dominated the study of acquisition of knowledge for many, many years seems to me to have been adopted quite without warrant and have no special status among the many possibilities that one might imagine as to how the mind functions. In this connection, it is illuminating to follow the debate that has arisen since the views that I have just sketched were advanced a few years ago as a program of research. I should say, since this position was resurrected, because to a significant extent it is the traditional rationalist approach, now amplified and sharpened and made far more explicit in terms of the tentative conclusions that have been reached in the recent study of linguistic competence. Two outstanding American philosophers, Nelson Goodman and Hilary Putnam, have made recent contributions to this discussion in contemporary philosophy or philosophy of language or philosophy of mind, and both misconceived, however, in my opinion, but instructive in the misconceptions that they reveal. You're going to want to look at Nelson Goodman's The Epistemological Argument, and you're also going to want to look at Hilary Putnam's The Innateness Hypothesis and Explanatory Models in Linguistics. Together with the paper of Chomsky, these were presented at the Innate Ideas Symposium of the American Philosophical Association and the Boston Colloquium for the Philosophy of Science. And a more extensive discussion of the papers of Putnam and Goodman, along with a number of others, appears in Chomsky's contribution to the Symposium, Linguistics and Philosophy. Goodman's treatment of the question suffers first from an historical misunderstanding and second from a failure to formulate correctly the exact nature of the problem of acquisition of knowledge. His historical misunderstanding has to do with the issue between John Locke and whomever John Locke thought he was criticizing in his discussion of innate ideas. According to Goodman, quote, Locke made acutely clear that the doctrine of innate ideas is false or meaningless. In fact, end quote. In fact, however, Locke's critique had little relevance to any familiar doctrine of the 17th century. The arguments that John Locke gave were considered and dealt with in quite a satisfactory way in the earliest 17th century discussion of innate ideas. For example, those of Lord Herbert and Descartes, both of whom took for granted that the system of innate ideas and principles would not function unless appropriate stimulation took place. For this reason, Locke's arguments, none of which took cognizance of this condition, are without force. And this observation is a commonplace. You can see also John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Descartes' position is one which Locke's argument always fails to reach. Locke assails the hypothesis of innate ideas in its crudest form, in which it is countenanced by no eminent advocate. Goodman, however, is free to use the term innate idea in conformity with Locke's misinterpretation of the doctrine if he wishes, but not to change sophistry as he does when others examine and develop rationalist doctrine in the form in which it was actually presented. And so, for this reason, Locke's arguments, none of which took cognizance of this condition, are without force. For some reason, he avoided the issue that had been discussed in the preceding half-century. Furthermore, as Leibniz observed, Locke's willingness to make use of a principle of reflection makes it almost impossible to distinguish his approach from that of the rationalists, except for his failure to take even those steps suggested by his predecessors toward specifying the character of this principle. But, historical issues aside, I think that Goodman misconstrues the substantive problem as well. He argues that first language learning poses no real problem, because prior to first language learning, the child has already acquired the rudiments of a symbolic system in his ordinary dealings with the environment. Hence, first language system or first language learning is analogous to second language learning in that the fundamental step has already been taken, and details can be elaborated within an already existing framework. This argument might have some force if it were possible to show that the specific properties of grammar, say, the distinction of deep and surface structure, the specific properties of grammatical transformations, the principles of rule ordering, and so on, were present in some form in these already acquired pre-linguistic symbolic systems. But since there is not the slightest reason to believe that this is so, the argument collapses. It is based on an equivocation similar to that discussed earlier in connection with the argument that language evolved from animal communication. In that case, as we observed, the argument turned on a metaphorical use of the term language. In Goodman's case, the argument is based entirely on a vague use of the term symbolic system, and it collapses as soon as we attempt to give this term a precise meaning. If it were possible to show that these pre-linguistic symbol systems shared certain significant properties with natural language, we would then be able to argue that these properties of natural language are acquired by analogy. Of course, we would then face the problem of explaining how the pre-linguistic symbolic systems develops these properties. But since no one has succeeded in showing that the fundamental properties of natural language, those discussed earlier, appear in pre-linguistic symbolic systems or any others, the latter problem does not arise. According to Goodman, the reason why the problem of second language learning is different from that of first language learning is that once one language is available, it can be used for giving explanation and instruction. He then goes on to argue that acquisition of an initial language is acquisition of a secondary symbolic system and is quite on par with normal second language acquisition. The primary symbolic systems to which he refers are rudimentary pre-linguistic symbolic systems in which gestures and sensory and perceptual occurrences of all sorts function as signs. But evidently these pre-linguistic symbolic systems cannot be used for giving explanation and instruction in the way a first language can be used in second language instruction. Therefore, even on his own grounds, Goodman's argument is incoherent. Goodman maintains that the claim we are discussing cannot be experimentally tested, even when we have an acknowledged example of a bad language, and that the claim has not even been formulated to the extent of citation of a single general property of bad languages. The first of these conclusions is correct in the sense of experimental test, namely a test in which we take an infant at birth, isolate it from all the influences of our language-bound culture, and attempt to inculcate it with one of the bad artificial languages. Obviously, this is not feasible, but there is no reason why we should be dismayed by the impossibility of carrying out such a test as this. There are many other ways, for example, those discussed earlier and the references cited there, in which evidence can be obtained concerning the properties of grammars and conclusions regarding the general properties of such grammars and how they can be put to empirical test. Any such conclusion immediately specifies correctly or incorrectly certain properties of bad languages. Since there are dozens of papers and books that attempt to formulate such properties, this second claim, that not a single generative property or general property of bad languages has been formulated, is rather surprising. One might try to show that these attempts are misguided or questionable, but one can hardly maintain seriously that they do not exist. Any formulation of a principle of universal grammar makes a strong empirical claim, which can be falsified by finding counter-instances in some human language along the lines of the discussion earlier. In linguistics, as in any other field, it is only in such indirect ways as this that one can hope to find evidence bearing on non-trivial hypotheses. Direct experimental tests of the sort that Goodman mentions are rarely possible, a matter that may be unfortunate but is nevertheless characteristic of most research.